Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure of conversation with my friend and chairman of the IRD's board, the well-known scholar of international religious freedom, Dr. Paul Marshall. We're talking about his latest book called Called to Be Friends, Called to Serve. It's the story of an unusual friendship between a well-known philanthropist, Howard Ahmanson, and a well-known civil rights leader, John M. Perkins. Paul Marshall, why did you write this book?
Um, I wrote it because I was asked to. But background leading to that, John Perkins was African American, born in Mississippi, orphaned, basically orphaned in 1930. Started the Christian Community Development Association later in life. He was moved to California, was successful there, but believed God was calling him back to Mississippi because he was getting all these young men coming out of Mississippi and getting involved in crime in California. So very much focused on African American community development. And then Howard Ahmanson, wealthy California philanthropist, California Business Magazine called his father the richest man in California. So anyway, there's Howard, and if you Google his name, you'll usually get all this stuff that he's a crazy right winger or something, which is totally out of it. Anyway, these two, John Perkins and Howard Ahmanson, became friends. Howard supported John's work, went on his board, but much more than that, they were friends. They'd go on holiday together. They would work together. Their families would visit. And this is a very unusual and fruitful relationship. So it was John Perkins. John is still alive. He's 95. Um, Said, I think this relationship is unusual enough and its lessons fruitful enough that there should be a book on this. So he suggested that to Howard, and Howard agreed. So they asked me to write it. I don't know if I was the first choice, but I was asked to write it, and I was just very glad of the opportunity and learned so much myself in putting it together. So.
Now, John Perkins is an ordained minister, is that correct?
Um, I don't believe he is.
He's not.
No,
But
I must no record of it. So
they're both active practicing Christians.
they're both active Christians, very active Christians. And for John, when he went to Mississippi, his focus is on, Mississippi in the 1960s. If you're African American, the government ain't going to help you. He says, look, if we're going to deal with our communities and with poverty, we've got to do it. And this was centered on the gospel. The first thing he was an evangelist. Then Mississippi started a Bible school. Okay. Then a regular school. Then got a health clinic. Then got a thrift store. Got people together to build houses together before there was a Habitat for Humanity. So very much Christ-centered and responsibility for ourselves. That's been the key of his ministry. One of his many pithy sayings is, what a man needs is Jesus and a job.
Now, Perkins' Wikipedia entry says he's an ordained Christian minister.
Okay, I've got no record of that, and I've read most of the things about him, including his autobiography.
He must
So,
have kept that from you or de-emphasized it, or Wikipedia could very well be wrong. But these two very different men, and Perkins is about 20 years older than Howard
yeah.
Ahmanson. So almost the only commonality between the two is their Christian faith and their desire to serve humanity, and originally in very different ways, but ultimately in some common ways or mutually
Yeah.
beneficial ways.
Yeah, their commonality is the root of that is they're both Christians, and they would both say that. And with all the other stuff, probably wouldn't have amounted to much unless they had that common commitment. But another one is commitment to serve the poor. They believe that's a thing that Jesus commanded, and it's a central theme in the Bible. And they combine that with a belief that that is best done not by government programs, but relying on markets, hence John's statement, Jesus and a job. So Howard was very much in favor of, we now use the word empowering, but empowering communities so that they can build, develop their own schools, their own churches, their own stores, and things of this kind. So those were two things they shared in common, rooted in Christian community development. And John founded the Christian Community Development Association. And people looked at what he was doing in Mississippi and sought to emulate it elsewhere. And there are now well over 1,000 communities built on that type of model. Obviously, they vary tremendously. The ones in Chicago would be different from Mississippi, but a common theme of Christian community and development. It's an amazing story.
In terms of their politics, Howard was, for much of his life, a Republican. I recall he changed his registration for sort of eccentric reasons, but is usually associated with the political right. Perkins, I assume, is a lifelong Democrat.
He usually avoided political labels. He certainly became active in the civil rights movement, but he never said much about party politics. When George W. Bush began that stress on faith-based action, John was on the advisory board of that. But he felt a bit burned about that. He said it really, there was more noise than actual activity coming out of that. And in recent years, probably a more left-wing figure. But again, the stress rooted in the gospel and self-help. He's probably now more open to government programs, even despite feeling with the Bush presidency that they didn't push it hard enough. So, but typically he's seen as more left. Howard is seen as more right, but they can't be pegged very easily. You mentioned that if you Google Howard, you'll still get him portrayed as a crazy right-winger, even though he became a Democrat in 2013. You said it was eccentric reasons. Basically, one of it was Proposition 8 in California, which was a constitutional amendment that marriage would be between one man and one woman. That carried before the courts then struck it down. But it carried because of African American and Hispanic votes. Whites voted against it. Howard said African Americans and Hispanics were, nearly all Democrats. And he said, those are the people I feel closest to. He says, economically, I oppose statism, but I'm fairly moderate economically. I'm socially conservative. And so, and he was upset that Republicans were not doing enough minority outreach, as we call it. So that was his own personal effort to do that. Things have changed quite a bit now, particularly with Trump getting much more Hispanic votes. But that was Howard's chief focus.
You've known Howard Ahmanson for many, many years. I assume you did not know John Perkins until this book project.
I had met him a few times.
Mhm.
I didn't know him well, but I first met him in Chicago in the early 1970s.
Hmm.
when there was various evangelical declarations on social justice, the Chicago Declaration. I was at those meetings. I know I look much younger, but I was there in the early 70s and ran into him at a few other occasions. And then at the Ahmansons, they have a guest house, not a commercial one, but another house because they have tons of guests to stay. And I was there, and John and several of the children were there. So I got to spend a few days with them in there. So not a close friend, but I interacted a few times and got to spend time with him in California. And he's a great man. And another point about he and Howard, they have quite the sense of humor. And
And you, having gotten to know Perkins fairly well in this project, how would you describe his character and personality beyond a good sense of humor?
um, he's warm, he listens, and he is so gospel-centered. They were very difficult to interview for different reasons. One is with John, you ask him a question about something, and he would begin replies, and then he would say, Jesus said, and then he'd quote from the Gospels about something and begin talking about that. And then he'd be not preaching, but sort of testifying to the gospel. And it was wonderful to listen. But I was saying, can we get back to the question? But that was his natural mode of talking, of being. If you do that, that comes out. Howard has a different thing. And one thing about the book is, John Perkins went through the mill. He was, son of a sharecropper in Mississippi, grade 3 or 4 education. Howard born into wealth, but a gilded cage. He has Tourette's syndrome, and which makes him stammer, has weird mannerisms, speaks slowly, hesitantly, and Tourette's syndrome was not seen as a diagnosis till the 1990s. So he was diagnosed as schizophrenic, particularly when his father died and left several billions, largely to his son. There were big fights in the family, and Howard was involuntarily committed to the Menninger Clinic in Kansas. So, as I put it, several months after his father died, almost literally in his arms, he was involuntarily committed to a mental institution 1,200 miles away, where he remained for 18 months. That's pretty traumatic for a 16-year-old. So there's a combination of suffering there. But that also means, getting back to interviewing Howard, most of the social practices we're accustomed to, he's got to work at. So, for example, if I introduced Howard to you, say, Howard, this is Mark Tooley. Howard, unless he concentrates, will just take that as a piece of information. Like I said, Howard, this is a Ming vase. Now he knows you're Mark Tooley. You've got to remember, when people do that, you've got to say, oh, hello, I'm Howard Ahmanson, and you shake hands. Those don't come naturally to him.
Yeah.
So John, in many ways, has shepherded him in that. He recounts how in board meetings, because Howard would be slow, he would stammer in coming to things. People would cut him off or start speaking before he do. And John said, I know Howard, he's a genius. He says, if he wants to say something, wait and let him say it. So, and Howard's going on John's board was a major step. One thing Howard has said that if a person asks me for money, doesn't mean they're going to get it, but okay, it's a reasonable request. I've got more money than most people. He says, but if they ask me for my time, that's a big ask. Because I've only got exactly the same amount of time as you have. So going on a board for him was a big step. That's a lot of time. Usually he refuses. He says, if I'm a big donor, I've got as much influence as a board member and I don't have to go to all those silly meetings. So there you go.
Obviously, Howard's wife, Roberta, has been a huge influence on him. I assume the same is true for the wife of John Perkins.
Yeah. Yeah. The Vera May is his wife, and she was sort of being deeply involved and at the center of many of these things, especially when John's work became known. And he was being called to all sorts of other places to advise, to help begin programs. Also internationally, World Vision began funding him, and he was doing work in India and Africa and elsewhere, which left Vera May and their children in charge of their children and much of their work, though. Something she called him out on. I mean, Vera May would not a woman to keep silent.
Mm.
And she said, you've got to spend more time back here. We've got
Mm.
to do that. And John also remarked of he and Vera May says, we've only ever had one fight, and that's still going on.
Mm.
So, so yeah, they both married remarkable and very strong women with their own minds and their own talents and skills.
And then finally, Paul, what's instructive about this book for others? Two very different men who develop a close friendship that has benefited their communities. How can we learn from their example?
One is they listened to each other. They didn't catalog each other. When they would have first met, Howard was connected with the R.J. Rush Jr., the Chalcedon Foundation, seen as sort of ultra-right. John was seen as leftist. But they met and talked. One thing I realized was that those categories and stereotypes usually don't work. People are much more complex creatures than we realize. So we need to know more about people before we make judgments about them and learn to listen to them. And then secondly, that your first loyalty is to Jesus. And we each have a bond with others who share that same commitment. And we need to make that primary and as much as we can resist other commitments, creating divisions in that.
And finally, Paul, could you hold up the book?
Yes, I will. Came out this year from Cascade Books, Width and Stock. And if you if you go to Facebook or Meta, look at my post, Paul Marshall. There's a few reviews of this book, but you can also order the book for 50% off. And there's a short video of John and Howard with Jody Hassett Sanchez produced. And it can also link to a 15-minute documentary on their lives. So if people want to, if you go through that channel, you can also see a documentary on them. And they're quite remarkable lives.
Paul Marshall, thank you for this conversation about your latest book, Called to Be Friends, Called to Serve.
Okay, thank you very much for having me, Mark.